Deus, Deus, salutaris nostra, Domini ex meus, Siri ex Deus, Deus noster, Domini ex noster, Angeli, Ave Pateti, Laudem Domino Majestatis,
How's everybody doing? Hoping you're having a fantastic day. So we're here with a Saturday morning special because we're going to specifically be covering, and this is going to be more comprehensive. This is going to be a lot less loose than maybe our other presentation, which was kind of a lot more of us kind of chatting and occasionally mentioning stuff. So this isn't going to be a scatter because a few people complained to me that our last discussion on this was a little bit scattered, and I was like, okay, you can cry about it, but I guess we will be a little bit more disciplined this time. So for this, this is going to be on marital chastity. So as a brief note, we will be specifically talking about the mechanics of certain marital acts. So if you have issues with that, please just kind of like skip this week. I don't know. Find like a really old stream of mine and then just listen to that. Or I don't know, listen to like one of Michael Lofton's like 8-hour streams or something like that. But don't listen to this one. So in order to help me with that, I have Eamonn and Hasan on here. So Eamonn, will you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Eamon Clark. I did a video with Christian maybe like, I don't know, 2 months ago, was it now? On a connected topic. I have an STL in moral theology, which is like a master's degree. It's a Roman degree, and I'm finishing my doctorate this year, hopefully, on social teaching stuff. But I've taken a really huge interest in Sixth Commandment questions in the past year or so, and have just hopefully finished the basic manuscript for a book on some of these things, not this particular issue, but something very closely connected.
So I heard you're the world expert on social justice.
I should be in another year on the Catholic origins of social justice.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
that's
which
fun.
comes out of Rosmini and Tapparelli and Pius IX's circle, and it's
as like I
the
guess
Rotore.
like a brief question on Rosmini. Do you think he ever was like his theses were actually condemned? Like actually his theses were erroneous. Like what's your kind of like personal take on
Okay, so there's a whole history there, and I'm not like a Rosmini expert.
Yeah.
So I mean, Rosmini is kind of drifting into what was called ontologism at the time, and it's kind of an illumination-based epistemology. The other guy who was really the nut job with this, also a priest, and then was prime minister of Piedmont, because that happened back then, was Vincenzo Gioberti. So if you really want to study the whole Rosmini thing, you look at, okay, Ratzinger's memorandum on it, but then also go read about Vincenzo Gioberti. You can read Gerard McCool's first volume on Neotomism, and you get a much better take than I could give. I mean, Pius IX's court got really annoyed with him when he fled with Pius IX to Gaeta. He retreated for like 2 weeks down to Naples, and then when he came back, all of his books were on the index, and they were taken off before he died, but like he never quite recovered from that, and then this cloud of suspicion was around him for, well, ever since. I'm actually in a former Rosminian novitiate house right now, oddly enough. So,
oh, really? That's
for
cool.
whatever that's worth.
That's cool.
I won't say exactly where to protect my identity, but it is what it is.
So, Hasan, what? Actually, everybody knows Hasan. I don't know. I wanted to ask Hasan a question of some. So where's the leopard print blanket?
That's what I was going to ask.
Oh,
It's in hiding. Ready
oh,
to
oh, so it's still
Oh!
there. Oh, okay. I get it.
Because it's the summer.
That's interesting. Okay, so the way that I kind of wanted to do this, and you guys already know about all the everybody out there, links below, merch, Patreon, whatever. I kind of want to get right
Christian,
into it.
speaking of merch, what about that nice categorical logic poster behind you?
Oh, this nice categorical
come
logic
from?
poster behind me. Well, if you
Yeah,
go to
where'd that come from?
Profide, so PROFIDE.io, profide.io, there's a great website there with fantastic posters. So something that you'll get when you start studying logic is that there's these things called the figures and moods of syllogisms. And this is in formal logic that you'll be studying the figures and moods of syllogisms. Now, the figures and moods of syllogisms, well, the figures not so much, but the appropriate moods for each one of the figures, that's hard to remember. There's like, I think it's 19 or 17 appropriate ones. So hard to remember, but it's fun when you actually have a poster that goes over this. It basically goes over all of the stuff that you don't feel like memorizing. So if you're not a professional logician and you just want to use logic, you're not going to spend all your time memorizing like a lot of these more autistic details. So this poster actually is a very, very good, very good summary of all of those issues that you'll need. So if you're a teacher or you're just a random guy who reads logic and would like something like that, go to profide.io. And I don't think there's any. Is there any like codes or anything with that? I don't know.
But we could create
do like
one. Maybe you can tweet it out later. We'll give people
yeah. Maybe we'll do like a special limited time offer on the poster, and we'll get those posters screaming off the press. I want a Profide categorical logic poster in every house in America.
Yes, we have a propositional logic poster too.
Oh yeah. But so if you're into like the modern logic stuff, like the hippie logic, then you can get the. I'm messing with you. Yeah, for those who don't know, propositional versus categorical logic, they basically teach the same thing. It's just a different like system of symbols, depending on whether you're following Aristotle's language or the language of more modern philosophers. But they basically just teach the same thing. So, I mean, if you want to get both, and if you're interacting with people of who use both sets of terminology, then it's all the more the merrier, as they say. So okay, so as a sort of overview of what we are going to talk about today, I found St. Thomas. St. Thomas writes a brief note on the issue of marital chastity and de malo. What's the specific reference? De malo. Question 15, Article 2. And he distinguishes between the sinfulness of the marital act. This isn't going to only be like act-based. We'll also talk about how the councils fit into this and how perfection fits into marriage. But he divides it between intention and then like the specific mechanics behind what would be a okay and a not okay act. So we're going to kind of follow that division. So first, we're going to be talking about intention in the marital act. So we'll get into that fun question of like, well, could somebody engage in the marital act for pleasure alone? Like, is that okay? Like, do you need to have procreation or the paying of the debt in mind? And then after that, we'll get into the specific mechanics of the certain types of acts that are appropriate and inappropriate. And Eamonn has done a lot of research. He made the famous like 500 tweet thread on Twitter, which is now gone, by the way. So
yeah,
if you want to go to like what is it, Knitter, I think is the one where you can look at. I promise that's the name of it, Knitter. is like you can look at past tweets. If you want to like go like the Wayback Machine or something to dig up Eamonn's tweets, please don't dig up my tweets with the Wayback Machine. I don't want my tweets from like 2 years ago dug up. But yeah, so the second half we'll be talking about that, and then we'll finish off with like a look at basically we're going to be following the teaching of St. Augustine. And well, this isn't the teaching of St. Augustine, it's the teaching, to be clear, it's the teaching of every single church father and the medievals and the theologians to the modern day on the nature of the interaction of the universal call of holiness when it comes to marriage, the council of chastity, things like spiritual marriage, and the relationship of our marriages to the perfect marriage of Saints Joseph and Mary. So, yeah, I think that'll get us pretty comprehensively. This is going to be both didactic and polemical. So we're both going to be establishing what the proper teaching is, and then also dealing with the most common sort of objections. So if you actually still can interact with this if you're listening. If you want to throw out some sort of objection that we think would be helpful to treat, remind us of something that people would often say in an objection, or just have a clarifying question that we think would be helpful, you can still comment in the live chat about those things. But I think that has been enough intro. So first we're going to get into the issue of intention within the marital act. So Eamon, if you kind of could give us just like a brief overview of like the concept of intention in moral acts just generally.
Sure. Okay. So, yeah. How many hours do you have? But look, basically for Thomas, there are two parts to an act. Okay. There's the object and there's the intention. The intention is about an end. Okay. The end is intended, and then you choose the means. And the choice is really where we're talking about what you're doing as an object. And so the intention is the motivation, which connects to the choice-worthy parts of the action that you do, exteriorly or interiorly. And with the object, you're dealing with something which is a hylomorphic spectrum, where you have aspects that are more formal and less formal. And this is why everybody, or basically everybody, messes up object and intention, because they read Veritatis Splendor, they say, oh, well, there are three fonts of morality: object, intention, and circumstance, but they don't read the deep cut. When Thomas talks about circumstances and objects and how they're actually, kind of together in one thing, right? So if you say, oh, my object is playing cards and I'm intending to win money. Oh, and the circumstance, it happens to be on an altar. Okay, well, so the object is actually sacrilege. What you're doing is sacrilege, because the circumstance so enters in to the formal part of your choice, your exterior choice, that it changes what your action is to a new species of action. Okay, and the intention is the thing that is beyond that motivates that action itself. So what do you want to get from it? That's kind of basic idea.
Yeah, that's a great intro. Anything to add, Hasan, or do you think that's good?
I think that's good.
Okay, so what I wanted to do now is St. Thomas is really just representative on this. There's going to be a few different controversies here, which Eamon can kind of give us an update after we look at what St. Thomas teaches. But St. Thomas, he's very, very consistent. I'm going to be going over actually all of the places that he talks about this. He talks about this in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different places, but they're all like paragraph length. So it's not gonna take me too long. So the first place that I wanted to look at is his commentary on the 10 Commandments. So I think why this is important to start out here is, one, it's one of his most mature works. and two, this is his catechetical works. So we're seeing here St. Thomas as a catechist. So this is what he was teaching when he was, because if a lot of people forget, St. Thomas was a priest. I mean, he was preaching sermons. He was catechizing people. He was hearing confessions. He was doing all of these things during his life. So when married couples would go up and ask St. Thomas, hey, when it comes to the intended goods of the marital act, like what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and this is what he would have taught them. This is the closest thing we see to like St. Thomas kind of, in sort of a less formal theological university environment. So he says, and we'll see this is a very common statement from him. There are some who say that intercourse between married persons is not devoid of sin, but this is heretical. For the apostle says, let the marriage be honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. Not only is it devoid of sin, but for those in a state of grace, it is meritorious for eternal life. So he's saying when it comes to moral acts, this is something that St. Thomas talks about in the beginning of Prima Secundae. When it comes to moral acts, there's no middle place. So it's either something which is good or bad. There's not like a neutral moral act for St. Thomas. There's neutral acts like scratch. He used the example of like scratching your beard. That's not like a what he calls a human act. But when it comes to moral acts, it's either going to be something which is meritorious or something which is evil. So St. Thomas says, here is where, if you're in a state of grace, here is where the marital act can actually be meritorious. So he says, sometimes, however, it may be a venial sin, sometimes a mortal sin. What is had with the intention of bringing forth offspring, then it is meritorious. What's important here is he's saying the intention to procreate children. Now, the procreative intention doesn't necessarily restrict itself to a lot of people when they hear procreation, they think, okay, making babies. That's not necessarily what procreation means in Catholic theology. It's actually a lot broader than that. You can't just like make babies and say, okay, I done my job in procreation. No, that's not how it works. It also involves the education and raising of those children. So when it comes to the so-called unitive aspect, the unitive is contained under the procreative. So for St. Thomas, the first way is procreation, which could either be, and this is he says it's an act of religion actually, because you're bringing forth children for the worship with the intention of the worship of God. So you're trying to expand the kingdom of God. So this is an act of religion, and under that
if
aspect,
you're not, then it's venial sin. If you don't at least have the habitual intention to raise your children to be saints, to worship God, then you're doing something immoral. Even if you're trying to procreate, it always has to be referred to the worship of God. That's actually really critical. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. No. I want to be interrupted. I think that's good to kind of like if I miss anything with like the explanation. So first, procreation, which remember, procreation doesn't just mean baby making. It also includes the intent to raise them. And then this one, it's a terrible translation. So when it is had only with the intention of rendering mutual comfort. So it's rendering the debitum, so rendering the marital debt. So if you don't know, the marital debt was established. It's something which can be known by natural law, but St. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 7, which is going to be another locus where this is commonly spoken of. And basically what the debt is it's rendered for the comfort of spouses. And what the comfort of spouses means is the as an aid for concupiscence. So it is meant to help the spouses become saints by diminishing their concupiscence. That's what the debt is. So by mutual comfort, it isn't talking about like warm fuzzies or anything like that. So
Can we briefly address the cartoonish bastardization of this? Which,
So
you know,
first is going to be procreation. Second is going to be rendering the debt. And then Eamonn is going to tell us why why it's not like a cartoonish sort of thing, but actually rendering the debt has to do with concupiscence.
right. Yeah. So the ham-fisted treatment, which maybe we've addressed elsewhere, is well, if your spouse wants you to use marriage, well, then you're just bound to. Okay, well, yes, but first it has to be like at least a reasonable request, like if you just had open heart surgery, like you can say no, because you'll die. Um, if you're in a public place or something like this, whatever. There are certain circumstances which, will allow one to say no, but more importantly, because that's kind of common sense, right? More importantly, there's another side, which is that one's spouse also ought to be solicitous to the person that they're requesting this from, right? And in real life, people aren't always automatically appealing to their rights, strictly speaking. And this ties into the whole thing with wifely obedience, right? Like,
Mm.
take the trash out. Well, is that like, you're my slave, take the trash out, or is it actually a request framed as an imperative statement, like something that we could talk about as human beings who are also adults, and not just an immediate automatic, I'm the king or I'm in charge, therefore you'll do what I say. Like, that's not how human beings are, and it's not how you should frame the discussion. So anyway, that kind of addresses it, I think. And
I
you
think
can
I'm
read the
cutting out. Am I good
manuals,
now?
they talk all about the the circumstances where one can legitimately refuse even a strict appeal to one's right. uh, they're mostly in agreement. There are some really fine small disagreements, like Martin Bonacina, I think, says, if your husband is leprous, then you can say no, whereas Thomas would actually say that's not the case, you're still bound. He gives that example in commentary on the sentences. So but generally, like, yeah, there's a binding law, but also human speech is not as simple as some people would make it out to be, and I think that's
Mm.
really important to understand and appreciate.
Yeah, it's also important to remember, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I still think it's on topic enough. But it's important to remember the nature of a head of a certain society, because what a lot of people forget um, is that the family itself is a society. Just like the church is a society, the church is a perfect society, unlike every other society. The state is a society. Like you're technically something like your reading group could be described very loosely as a society. In every society, this is the way in which the philosophers, the Catholic philosophers, are going to prove from natural law the headship of the husband in the family. Is every society needs some sort of head. Like you can't have a reading group unless you have a guy who sets up the reading group meetings. So obviously, from that example, we can see that the nature of a head can be very broad, depending on the different circumstances. Some are going to have like the coercive power to like kill you, like a king or some sort of government official has the power to
Pater
take your life.
familias.
Yeah, he has he has the power to some of these heads have the power to take your life. Some have the power to throw you in jail. Some have basically the power to kick you out of the reading group. There's like a lot of different. Some have the power to excommunicate your soul from the church and cut you off from the sacraments. There's a very wide range. So when it comes to the formation of the family, technically, this is actually kind of a fun topic. Technically, the father of the family is part of the society of the state, and then like through him, the other members of the family interact with the society of the state. But the father of the family is the head of the society of the family. and he directs them towards their end. So when it comes to the individuals of that society, individuals of a society are directed by the head insofar as they are members of that society. So as an example, I saw this very cartoonish example of patriarchy, and I call myself a sort of patriarchy supporter, but there's like some very cringe examples of this on the internet. This one woman who like posted a screenshot of her text with her husband, and she's like, "Oh, I got my husband's permission to start like a group chat with my friends." And it was like it's super like I felt like a super like cringe example. Like I guess like your intentions were probably fine, but that's like really cringe to screenshot that, put that on Twitter and whatever. So, like, if my wife wanted to start a group chat with her friends, I wouldn't just be like, "Woman, why did you not ask me permission first?" Like, that would be because I mean, that doesn't affect her role as a member of the society in which I am a head. Now, on the other hand, that may indirectly infringe on her membership in my society. So, let's say she spends like 5 hours a day talking to her friends on this group chat, and it's actually infringing on her role as a wife and mother, and infringing on the good of the society in which I'm a head. I may, at that point, tell her to like, look, either you need to control your time on this or that, or you just need to delete or leave the group chat or whatever. You can't be a member of something which is affecting the society in which I'm a head over. And it's the same way with the state, because technically the parents have the authority of the education of children, but if the parents are lax in their carrying out of this duty, and it's affecting the society of the state, technically the state can step in when it comes to the education of the children, even though it's not directly their prerogative. It can become indirectly their prerogative. So yeah, that's the whole thing when it comes to that. Hasan, did you have any comments on that issue, or you think we can continue on this?
No, I think that's pretty good. That hit all the things that came to my mind.
Okay, good. Wow, it's almost like Hasan and I have talked about this before. I know. I ask Hasan like, "Oh, do you have anything to add?" And it's like, "Well, we probably talked about this like half a dozen times before." So,
all I can really contribute is that the places where it becomes interesting is where St. Thomas talks about the difference between a man and a woman and their equality in like how serious it is if one of them commits adultery. And he talks about how the man's position as governor, but not as judge, basically. He doesn't have like a kind of judicial rulership over his wife like a political authority.
Yeah, which is why
it's interesting because you can compare and contrast that again with the pater familias. You can see how Roman society breaks down, in the context of the pater familias, and then the intermarriage with the patricians and the plebeians. You can follow that. It's your homework, I guess, if you're watching the stream.
It's also interesting to consider that this idea is something that the church has been working with for the last couple of years, although it's obscured, which is this relationship between primacy of rulership or governance within a society, whether it's a society of two or more, and the obligation of consultation, the obligation of trying to listen to and understand the needs of inferiors and things like that, which is what's coming into the concept of synodality recently. It's very related to this topic of authority within the marital society.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody I can briefly. Oh, wow, I like your profile picture. Why does the male
has his
need
face in it? That's important, Christian.
Has his face? Yeah, that's true. He has his face in it. So
we found that out.
If I don't have my face, I know my profile picture isn't my face, and people like give me crap about it on Twitter all the time. Like I have literally over 1,000 hours of live streams with my face on it. So why does the male need to be over the woman? Okay, so the general argument is going to be this has to do with the nature of societies. Is every single society, everything from a book club to the Senate to the how to like uh, to like the church needs some sort of head in order to direct the lower members, or the society is just not going to work. If you have like three people of equal authority, and there's no way of kind of breaking the tie or whatever, you're just going to have a separated society that's just not going to run. And if you want like more in-depth arguments for why a society needs a head, you can look in De Regno by St. Thomas. That's very good. He also covers this in another place in Summa Contra Gentiles. But
Or Tapparelli. Tapparelli is the guy for this in the modern era.
oh, really?
Basically, yeah, cutting against contract theory. Basically says there's never been such a thing as a society built around contracts. There are societies built around realities where there are de facto leaders instantly, because everybody's unequal, and that's helpful.
Yeah.
And the inequality between man and woman, generally speaking, as general norms, are physiology, biology, and psychology, where the man is freer, I'm using that word, freer for public affairs, and the woman is less free, and therefore the man is set over the woman in administration, which then, of course, connects to the topic du jour on holy orders and the, I guess you could say, castration of holy orders, which is really, unraveling the part about administration, right? And that's a thread to pull. Like, okay, what does it mean that holy orders is for rulership? Of course, the fullness being in the bishop, who models that office of the Lord in particular, whereas the deacon is teaching, also given to Adam because he wasn't deceived the way Eve was. And then the priest, okay, is the fulfilling the priestly function, but then the bishop is the one who's especially modeling the rulership of Christ. It's all connected. The spiritual is actually a mirror, or a reflection of the natural, or vice versa. Interestingly enough, I have an exorcist friend who says the demonic and occult world also mirrors this. And the example that he gave is that a warlock, one who's into the occult world, can sometimes, if they're powerful enough or whatever, can discern if a host has been consecrated, whereas a witch can never do that. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah. So yeah. He was asking why the head can be male. I was getting to that. But yeah, it has to do with the one. It has to do with the difference between men and women, which is principally found in passivity and activity and passivity. Like this is everything from physiologically to psychologically, to the way in which thought is done. So we see this when it comes to the overwhelming lack of administrative potential in the overwhelming amount of women in this world. It's just women due to their psychological disposition are in the majority of cases unfit for rule. That's just a brute fact, and that's the reason why the moralists will generally give. But I mean, it's also just a matter of revelation. If you just want to, if you're a Catholic, which I'm assuming you're a Catholic, we could just appeal to revelation, principally found in the fact that Christ is masculine and the Church is feminine, and also with the specific apostolic injunctions in Ephesians 5, for example. But yeah, we could also talk about what Eamonn said with the greater freedom that men have due to the fact that women's physiological makeup is just ordered towards childbearing and towards that type of work, which really doesn't free them for administration. But
Men hunt and women gather. That's my one-liner that I go to. It's
True.
always been that way. It always will be that way. And there's never been a true matriarchal society in all of recorded human history. There are matrilineal societies, but never a true matriarchal society ever. So
Yeah. I
that's
think every like example that gets brought forward is scope. But let's continue.
matrifocal,
So
matrilineal.
There have been a few, but they're very like short-lived, and they're spawned by weird events in patriarchal societies, like women separating off because of abuse and then expanding into it. But that's more like a small like commune, and they don't last.
Right.
It's not like a
like the begginages.
yeah, this is going to be the illicity of oral stimulation. That's going to be like the sort of second part of this stream once we get through the intention part. Okay, so the first reason is where the first reason is the why can't I find it? I want to highlight it. Oh yeah, the intention of bringing forth offspring. So remember we talked about procreation. Second is the paying of the debt, not mutual comfort. The paying of the debt, act of justice and virtue. So here we see St. Thomas talk about where intention becomes sinful. So he says, when it is only a cause of exciting lust, although within the limits of marriage, it is a venial sin or with a venial sin. And when it goes beyond these limits, so as to intend intercourse with another if possible, it would be mortal sin. So basically what he's saying is if you are engaging in the act and your purpose is the lust that you have for your wife, that would be a venial sin. Now, if it's lust to where St. Thomas describes this better in De Malo, but where like you don't really care whether it's your wife or not, like you'd kind of do it with anybody. You just want to like have relations with somebody, and your wife happens to be the easiest person to do that with, then it would be a mortal sin. So
even what the later manuals pick up on and kind of pull out of this is if you're imagining someone else, that's actually something that they talk about, is to use your spouse to fantasize about another person. That would be also coming under that fourth one.
Okay, so this is second one is from his commentary on 1 Corinthians 7. He says, hence it should be noted that the conjugal act is sometimes meritorious and without any mortal venial sin, as when it is directed to the good of procreation and education of a child for the worship of God. And notice, he actually does specifically explain here that it's procreation and including the education of a child for the worship of God. Yeah. So that would include the unitive aspect. But then it is an act of religion, or when it is performed for the sake of rendering the debt. It is an act of justice. But every virtuous act is meritorious if it is performed with charity. But sometimes it is accompanied with venial sin, namely when one is excited to the matrimonial act by concupiscence, which nevertheless stays within the limits of the marriage, namely that he is content with his wife only, but sometimes is performed with mortal sin, as when concupiscence is carried beyond the limits of marriage. For example, when the husband approaches his wife with the idea that he would just as gladly or more gladly approach another woman. And then another instance is found in his commentary on 1 Thessalonians. I just wanted to show the consistency here. In sanctification and honor, because this is the proper use of marriage, since it is for the good of the offspring or for fulfilling an obligation. And so marriage may be without sin. And the fulfilling of an obligation, that is I don't know why they translate this so many different ways. This is just the rendering of the debt over here. And so marriage may be without sin, but sometimes a venial sin is involved if concupiscence is not exercised beyond the limits of marriage. That is when, although having concupiscence, a person does not indulge in it except with his own wife. But when this takes place outside the bonds of marriage, the action becomes a mortal sin. And this happens when he would perform the action, even if she were not his wife, and more willingly with another woman. And then he quotes Hebrews 13 and 1 Peter 3. And then the section from De Malo, which is his best section on this, personally. Crap. Are you going to mess with me? Okay. Oh, I accidentally messed it up. Okay, there you go. So Therefore, when there is a sin of sexual lust only because of the disorder of the desire, for example, when one has intercourse with one's wife lustfully, we need to make a distinction. We need to make the distinction between because the disorder is sometimes such as to exclude the ordination of one's ultimate end. For example, such is the case when a man desires sexual pleasure to such a degree that he would not abstain from it because of God's precept and would will to have intercourse with his wife or even another woman, contrary to the law of marriage. And then also it is important to note he would will to have intercourse with his wife contrary to the law of marriage. This is talking about the intention to perform illicit acts with one's own wife. And then there is a mortal sin, since the desire for sex is not kept within the bounds of marriage. And the disorder of the desire sometimes does not eliminate the ordination of the ultimate end, namely, when a man, although excessively desiring sexual pleasure, would abstain from it because he would act contrary to God's precept, and he would not have intercourse with any woman unless she was his wife. And then the desire stays within the bounds of marriage, and such is a venial sin. And then there's, in the response to the seventh objection in De Veritate, question 25, article 5. Let me pull that up real quick. So again, when a man approaches his wife from concupiscence, there's a venial sin, provided that he does not exceed the bounds of wedded life. It is accordingly clear that the very moment of concupiscence preceding reason in a married person is a venial sin. But when reason determines what one may licitly crave, then even though sensuality goes out of it, there will be no sin. And then lastly, this is from the Supplementum, because if you remember, St. Thomas actually never finished his Summa, unfortunately. So they had to supplement the third part of the Summa with some of his writings from his Sentences commentary. So this is him writing as actually a very young man. It says, consequently, the right answer to this question is that if pleasure be sought in such a way as to exclude the honesty of marriage, so that, for example, someone should not turn to his wife because she is his wife, but only because she is a woman, prepared to do the same with her if she was not his wife, there's a mortal sin, because such a man is said to be too ardent a lover of his wife, because his ardor carries him away from the goods of marriage. If, however, he seeks pleasure within the bounds of marriage, so that it would not be sought in another woman, it is a venial sin. And then the reply to the objection one, I think this kind of sums it up well. A man seeks a harlot's pleasure in his own wife. Whenever he sees nothing else in her than he might look for in a prostitute. So that is pleasure. Okay, so now, is there anything else to add on that part, or can we kind of start getting to the...
Yes, just quick. It's important to note that Thomas always sees the request for the marital debt as being venial sin, at least. This follows Augustine. By the time you get to Alphonsus going through, first of all, Albert is the first one to kind of move away from that.
Mhm.
Then actually Dennis the Carthusian is involved in this discussion. Very, very bizarre history of this thing. But then I think kind of the key other major player is Lemestre, who you can read about this in Noonan. And then with Alphonsus, he's not in agreement with that position. So you have Alphonsus kind of saying, no, you can use marriage to avoid concupiscence in yourself, provided there's no other reasonable way to do so. Okay, so that kind of just quickly addresses that issue. Anyone had that?
Yeah, I read, you know, like the really long book on spiritual marriage.
Yes, you sent it to me.
Yes. So I'm like finally doing like a systematic read, because I've looked through parts of it, but I've never done a systematic read. I've actually been listening to it, and I got through like probably maybe like 2/3 of it last night, and it's a really, really interesting history, because when it comes to the Dominicans, their position was actually seen as like a little bit more of a liberal position on a lot of these issues. So yeah, but I mean, take that for whatever you may. They were seen as a more liberal position. They actually their position was, for the most part, accepted, where a lot of the harsher positions that some have were rejected.
The
this comes
condemned
from
proposition that's relevant is Innocent the 11th, who condemned, after a lot of activism from the French in particular, that the use of marriage for pleasure alone is void of all venial guilt. I think that's the precise formulation, which then you can find all kinds of loopholes for this, like, okay, well, what about pleasure and honor, or pleasure and, relief of concupiscence? That's the really strange one that has a lot of puzzles. Yeah. The the one that Sanchez proposes, well, he addresses the union of signifying the union of Christ and his church, which is an interesting thought. Then Sanchez also just proposes no motive at all, which is particularly bizarre.
You can't do a human act with no motive.
This this is what Sanchez talks about.
Oh,
It's
man.
actually Sanchez's solution to this, which is a little strange. Sanchez writing before? I should know this. I forget if Sanchez is before. I think he's before Innocent the 11th. But yeah, Sanchez was a little bit liberal on this point. But anyway, just to note the history of this question a bit.
Okay, anything else to add, Hasan, on intention?
No, that was great.
Okay, good. So now we're going to the second part, and the second part, this is the part where everybody asks a trillion questions on. So make sure, again, remember, if you're somehow disturbed by these things, or you have no other reason beyond vain curiosity, then you should probably exit the stream right now. So yeah,
Or,
just a
or go
reminder.
for a run and listen to this.
Yeah, go
So
for a
while you're
run.
While you're physically distressed, you can't lust, basically.
That's true. Let's go for a sprint.
Yeah.
So, okay. Where do you how do you systematic this issue? I can't think of a particular order in my head.
Yeah, I've got one because I wrote a 500 tweet thread about this. Maybe the first thing to start with is I suppose, modern common sense position, which is the one rule principle, which you find in a lot of popular authors. Big one that everyone talks about is Gregory Popchak. But then also this kind of comes up in Christopher West's, though West isn't drilling into it as much as Popchak. And then other, people who have really no business talking about moral theology will throw this out there like, oh, guys, girls, as long here it is. You can do whatever you want as long as it ends the right way. Oh, and as long as it's mutual, like it's not violent. That's it. And okay. Let's count the problems with this. First of all, nobody really says this until 10 seconds ago, so that should give you pause right away. Most authors today that I'm aware of who seriously talk about this note a couple of potential problems that they kind of say, here, these are red flags, even if they think that certain things are illicit incorrectly. They still are aware of potential issues, and they might advise that prudentially just don't do this anyway. Then third, there are very serious arguments for why that position is incorrect. Okay, and we can go through them. I've broken it down into 4 parts in my head. Okay, and a potential 5th or 6th, depending on which particular perverse act you want to talk about, like hygiene or safety. Okay, you can physically harm yourself if you're doing certain perverse things. But I don't know. Maybe I can start with my baking analogy. People seem to respond to that really well. What do you think?
Yeah. I like the baking analogy. The baking analogy is always my favorite.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So baking is an act inside of a process, which is what we're talking about with the use of marriage. It's not just an encounter where there are persons acting together. There's an act nested inside of a process. Okay. You want to bake some bread. Okay. The idea is you're going to bake the bread so you can eat it. Great thing. Wonderful. No problem. What do you have to do to bake the bread? Well, first, you probably want to get the oven warm, at least a little warm ahead of time, probably. And you may have to knead the dough at least a little bit. Maybe you buy some like pre-made dough, but like it needs some kind of, activation of the yeast, maybe a little. What you don't want to do is put the dough in the sink, because that's not baking. And you don't want to put the dough in the trash can, because that's not baking. And you don't want to keep kneading the dough and heating the oven to get really hot more than it needs to be, because that's not baking. And you also don't want to keep the oven running past the point where the dough has risen and is baked, because that's also not baking. So if you can follow the line there, we are talking about a number of perverse actions, 3 there, but we're going to focus on the first 2, which are the use of various parts of the body, which are classically treated by the authors with extreme delicacy when they do treat them. Okay, Thomas doesn't even really address these things directly. He's very, very, ashamed to mention these things, but I think we're kind of past the point now where we have to start talking about these things directly. Let's work backwards, just like I did in my thread. The problem, which basically everybody talks about, is the danger of pollution, okay, or completion outside of the natural act. Okay. This is noted by all of the authors who really talk about it. If there's some serious risk that, especially the man in particular, is going to reach completion outside of the natural union of man and woman, very, very serious, right? Grave matter, don't do it, just no. Which I think of itself suffices to say, don't do these things, because you're taking this risk where you're going to be doing something which is deeply affecting your powers of reasoning. Why would you presume to be able to exercise the self-control necessary to do this, even if it were listed in itself, which it's not?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the first problem.
Yeah, I think what's helpful is to distinguish between approximate and a remote danger of pollution. So when it comes, and it's also what's important. You said especially the male. So this also fits in with the female as well. That's important to note. So when it comes to the distinction between approximate and a remote occasion, this really has to do with whether the act is essentially ordered towards completion or merely accidentally ordered towards completion. So yes, it's possible because I know what the response is going to be like. Oh well, you're going to say kissing is okay, and technically, with some people, kissing could possibly result in pollution, or this could possibly result in pollution, or that could possibly result in pollution. But those things aren't essentially ordered towards pollution. If it happens, it's going to happen as something which is accidental to the act. So when it comes to what are referred to as non-consummated venereal acts, so this would be certain kisses, touches that are going to be able to be licitly used to prepare for the marital act. None of those things are essentially ordered towards completion. Notice, essentially ordered towards completion. So even if completion does not occur and it's ordered towards completion, that still is going to provide a proximate occasion or proximate danger of pollution. So that's very important to this distinction right here that we're laying out. That's just going to slice right down the middle, and it's going to really answer basically any sort of question you're going to have. Is is this okay? Is that okay? Is that okay? Is that okay? Ask yourself, is it ordered towards completion? For example, basically anything that involves an orifice is going to be ordered towards completion. So that's an easy question right there.
The one-liner I've been giving people, which I've never gotten a response to, especially from Mr. Will Noland, who was all about this. The question is, well, okay, could you use your dog for 30 minutes? Well, it's going to end the right way. So, and I think like 99.999% of people will intuitively realize, oh, no, because that's an act of itself.
Mm.
And then they sprinkle some kind of magic fairy dust on these other things, say, well, it's with my spouse, so it's okay. Why? And we'll come to the argument that Alphonsus makes. He makes an analogous argument. He says, why does a man really commit fornication if he begins with another woman and finishes in his own wife, right? That's the argument that Alphonsus lays out, which we'll get to. So
Yeah, so that kind of provides, I guess, the first, and I think this is the most obvious thing to people, and this really like, so I mean, there's just a lot of like bad responses that you'll get, where it's like, oh, well, like technically hugging your wife can involve this, and like holding hands with your wife could cause this, or kissing your wife could cause this, or like why can you like manually stimulate to prepare for the act, but you can't do that? Well, it has to do with whether something is essentially ordered or accidentally ordered. And St. Thomas is going to say in the second half of the De Malo quote that I didn't bring up. I might have sent it to Hasan, and I think it was, yeah. I'll just pull that up real quick because he has a very good quote on this. Okay. Okay. Okay, so touches, embraces, and kisses, insofar as they are ordained for act of fornication, result from consent to fornication, and insofar as they are ordained only for the pleasure in them, result from consent to the pleasure, which consent constitutes a mortal sin. So basically what he's saying is if something is ordered towards a pleasure that is essentially if a pleasure is ordered towards a pleasure that's essentially ordered towards completion, even if completion doesn't occur, that still constitutes a mortal sin. Like if you do, like, let's say
this
fun
takes
example.
us to sodomitic affection, right? This is the next big point,
Yeah.
which is the
So
sodomitic affection.
there's a fun example that gets brought up in some moral theology manuals. Is it's like, okay, if somebody has really bad vision, and let's say he's hunting, and he wants to kill his hunting partner, and he sees a deer out there, and he wants to kill his partner. He thinks that's his partner, and he shoots it, and he hits the deer. Or even, let's say, a more fun example is if he misses the deer that he's trying to shoot and actually hits his friend. Is he like still guilty for the sin of murder? Of course, because moral acts are specified by their formal objects, which is the intention of the act. It's not like some sort of like material, weird sort of material thing. So if like, for example,
well, it's both. It's all of the things. If I can jump in, so to go back to the layers of hylomorphic realities. The intention is formal with respect to the object, and then the choice-worthy part of the chosen object is formal with respect to the other circumstances. If that's helpful. So
Yeah,
the choice-worthy thing in his shooting of the gun is killing his friend, right? So that connects to his intention, which is his death.
Yeah. So when it comes to this is sodomitic affection, but when it comes to desiring a certain pleasure, which is ordered to completion, it is guilty of this. It is still guilty of the sin, even if completion doesn't occur. And that's going to be St. Thomas's argument in De Malo. So if you wanted to, or if Hasan had anything to add on the last point on proximate and remote occasion.
No.
Okay, so we're going to get into sodomitic affection now. But I actually have to go to the bathroom real quick. So if you just wanted to keep talking, I don't care. I'll catch.
Okay. Yeah, so this one is a little more complicated because we're getting into the interior working of the passions vis-a-vis the will, and it's especially bizarre because we're dealing with a case in which someone's reason might not be functioning all the way. But the thing is, usually these kinds of actions don't happen by accident. They're kind of planned ahead of time, right? And so that excuse goes away. It's like intentionally getting drunk, next to a cliff, and then, being next to this person you dislike, and, oh, what happened? I pushed them off the cliff. Oops. No. You're responsible for it insofar as it's indirectly voluntary. The affection part is basically a desire for the act itself as a disordered act. So insofar as it's sodomitic, and as a brief aside, the word sodomitic or sodomy has gone through a kind of evolution in the literature. It's a little too much to kind of trace that whole development, but basically in the way that it's being used here in the stream, it means any kind of unnatural act upon another person. There are various ways that other authors talk about this: perfect sodomy, imperfect sodomy, true sodomy, like whatever. You'll find a bunch of different taxonomies for the vocabulary. The point is, it's an unnatural affection insofar as it's a desire, an inclination of the passions towards the pleasure which comes from that unnatural action. Okay, so insofar as one wants this thing, especially as something leading to completion, something that's intrinsically ordered towards completion, the finis operis, regardless of the finis operantis, is ordered towards completion in whichever part of the body. It's going to be a disordered kind of affection. Okay. So this is not only going to be for the man acting upon the woman in various places that are undignified, which is the next part of the argument. It would also hold for the woman using things which, this comes to the first part, like the main argument, which simulates intercourse. Okay, so simulation of copulation, right? So something which she would use that actually simulates or mimics the male organ in the way that procreation is done would also be an issue. But specifically in this case, we're talking about the unnatural use of it in other parts of the body. But also, again, I go back to the example with livestock or animals. If a woman begins a sexual act with an animal, she will have in the birth canal, okay, in the vas debitum, then it's also going to be a kind of sodomitic affection, because there's a desire for this unnatural pleasure, which has its own interior logic that's ordered towards completion. So that's kind of the brief overview of that.
Okay, so Hasan, what do you have to say on sodomitic affection?
Nothing that wasn't already said.
Okay, I think really these are the two most convincing points. Is just danger of pollution, which a lot of people take danger of pollution the wrong way. They're like, well, I can like have self-control, or I've been doing this forever and have never like fallen into that. That's not what a proximate occasion is. It has to do with the ordering of the act, and this is the same misunderstanding that William Knowles has on Noland, all of the screenshots he's going to give from these manuals talking about non-consummated venereal acts. It's like it's kind of insane. And I guess if we wanted to have our own portion of just briefly debunking his reading of these, it's like in the same context you'll get a section talking about, okay, here are the different occasions that extraordinarily might allow for a non-consummated venereal act between unmarried spouses. So if he's talking about things that are essentially ordered towards completion but don't reach completion, why would that make sense for him to talk about it? No, they're talking about certain court customs that may require touching, and certain bad customs which can otherwise still be allowed, and that's more of that's a story for a different day when it comes to touching and its
Yeah, that's
status.
actually a much more complicated topic. The
Yeah,
authors are kind of all over the place on this. McHugh and Callan give a really good treatment, though, if you want a good rundown.
Okay, so
Then the next part is
what comes
dignity.
after?
Okay,
Dignity.
and the SparkNotes version is if you can't imagine like the great biblical couples doing some action, don't do it. Okay, just appeal to common sense piety, and like what are certain parts of the body for? Like what is the kind of thing that would be shameful? Right. And I had a more elaborate argument in my mega thread, but I think we can just leave it there because it's so gross. So if you can't imagine the Blessed Virgin Mary being conceived in this way, don't do it.
True.
Why would you do it? So that's
so
my addressing of dignity.
yeah. So with dignity, yeah, I don't think I have much to add, and I don't think a lot of people who are on like the lay level would find this to be like a super demonstrative argument for the conclusion. I think that's kind of more like a cherry on top of what we've already said. So is there anything that happens after dignity?
Yes, there's what I see as the core problem, which is simulation, which we've already kind of addressed with the Alphonsus quote, right? This is like putting the dough into the sink or into the trash can. You're now doing something other than a process that's ordered towards the act of baking, right? You are now using an organ which is constituted in a certain way, which is precisely to go into a vase, a particular vase, right? Not some other vase, not someone else's vase, not an animal vase, not an artificial vase. And then you have the vase itself, which is built to receive fully a certain organ, right? And this is you get the examples. Well, chewing on a pen cap is that unnatural? Yeah, well, it's an artifact, first of all, and it doesn't have its own intrinsic purpose that's given to it by nature, whereas the male organ does, and it's to go there for this precise action, right? Now, insofar as it's necessary to knead the dough in order to prepare for that action, fine. This is where you get the questions of manual stimulation, right? Of the man and also of the woman, okay? But if you're using something to simulate, right, to replace the vase or the male organ as such, then you're now engaging in something that is an entirely different act, right? And this is Alphonsus' argument. Well, if you can start anywhere as long as it ends the right way, then why can't you start with another woman? Why? And again, the principle they'll fall back on, the interlocutors who aren't here, but it's with my spouse. Well, so, it's just not really an argument. It's just kind of foot pounding. And then the other part of simulation, which is, I guess, a more material kind, is excessive use of stimulation. So kneading the dough past the point where it actually has to be, heating the oven past the point where it's ready. You're now exceeding proportion between process and act, right? Everything is ready. Now what you're doing is wasting time. And that's not well ordered. And I would say if it's done with, deliberation, then it's serious. Yeah.
Yeah, because
you're replacing the act. Like you're doing something else at that point.
Yeah,
right.
St. Thomas describes this, and he basically says if the enjoyment that you're getting from the stimulation is ordered towards itself, like you're lingering in some sort of act out of the enjoyment that you get out of that act, that's sodomitic affection right there. But if it's something which is accidental, and it just comes along with the fact that it's something that has to be done for the marital act to be properly engaged in, then that's something which is fine. So in like, people are going to say, well, that's like kind of a weird sort of like subjective standard, and I don't really know how to judge that. It's like, no, you kind of know like the difference between, okay, preparation and then like a lingering enjoyment of some sort of non-venereal some sort of non-consummated venereal act that you're using for foreplay.
Yeah.
See,
The line I kept going back to in the Megathread, RIP Megathread, was once the organs are prepared for union and have a reasonable chance of reaching completion in that union, then the preparation is over. Now, if you've clearly and deliberately crossed that point, you're just engaging in mutual autoeroticism. It's just what it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is maybe it'd be a good idea to discuss this briefly. This is where some of the modern day Alphonsites actually are getting it completely wrong. Like what is that man's name with the catechism.cc website?
Ron Conti.
That
Yes.
guy. Yeah.
Ron Conti. So yeah, I think we should probably briefly discuss the fact that we don't completely agree with him, and we think that
No, he
wrong.
does a lot of good research, but he just, his reasoning skills are not the best. It just has to be said. Seems like a very pious guy, means well, but yeah, does not have all the equipment. But he's done helpful research. So if you're quote mining, he's the guy.
So where would you say that we differ with him? If you wanted to introduce people.
His thought is so disorganized that I couldn't like put my finger on anything in particular. I just know that if you're reading his descriptions of what certain statements from like the Sacred Penitentiary mean or whatever, it's off. Like his whole take on these things is a little weird. He kind of generally reaches the right conclusions, which is, hey, don't do this kind of stuff, but his actual arguments aren't quite coherent.
Okay.
So
that's fair.
all I can say without really looking at the texts and thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
God bless him.
Yeah. He because a lot of people who are looking into answers for this question, Ron Conti is the only person that they find actually treating it. And
and then Catholic intimacy, RIP.
Oh yeah, Catholic intimacy. That was horrific. Yeah, just the most cringeworthy things you'll ever read are on the Catholic intimacy blog. Oh my.
Yeah. And just the idea in general.
Yeah, I mean the phrase "pat on the tail." I will never recover from hearing that. That was I don't think I've cringed so hard in my life. I've cringed hard at a lot of things, but that was especially cringeworthy. Okay, so now in the last section, and this I guess is kind of Hasan's thing. They talk about how now there's another argument for this, which is basically like, okay, let's say you just disagree with everything we've talked about so far, and you're just like, I don't believe in that nonsense at all. I think that all your moral theology arguments so far are just bunk. Well, the last point is, okay, let's pretend you're in that situation. Even here, we're going to have to ask the question of, one, building the virtue of chastity, and then two, the perfection of the spiritual life, which is found in the going away from, I guess would be the best way, or the tending towards the ceasing of marital relations. in the sort of perfect mirroring of the marriage of Joseph and Mary, and then also the habitual keeping of the counsel of chastity. So, Hasan, did you want to do your thing on those?
Well, where should we start with that?
I think where it would be nice to start on the just kind of broad nature of the universal call to holiness, and kind of, I guess, like on the perfection of spiritual life chapters, like 1 through 3, where he talks about just generally, okay, what our counsels are, what's the perfection of charity, how are we not saying that, like, oh, you can't salt and pepper your food or you're sinning,
Yeah.
sort of thing.
So the universal call to holiness means that we're all called to pursue perfection. So there's a general obligation to pursue a development of the counsels in your life. But there's no obligation, as with natural law, right? As with like binding precepts, to actually act upon all of the counsels at any one time, or any of the counsels at any one time, unless you've obliged yourself by some kind of vow.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an obligation to gradually pursue a deepening of the practice of the counsels in your life. And this is what trips everybody up, because most people are thinking about, well, what's allowed and what's not allowed. There's no. I think this is a deeper. This goes back to a deeper problem of people thinking about moral theology simply as an enumeration of delicts and a taxonomization of them, rather than understanding moral theology as a guide to as a guide to a progression towards something which St. Thomas calls super romano modo when he's talking about the Beatitudes, where each of the Beatitudes, considered in its fuller sense, is a certain action of the virtues, of most of them of natural virtues, but above a natural human mode, or above the manner of doing these things in a naturally human way. And so if we're going to pursue the counsels, if we're going to pursue the Beatitudes, we need to have that hammered out, what that looks like. What are the ways to have acts of the virtues in a heroic way, which goes beyond the natural mode, but also doesn't cross over into the extremes either side of the mean that constitutes the acts of the virtues? How do we do that? And because this is something that people don't talk about much, I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people want to kind of say, okay, this area is for the religious, and forget about that. I've got this a lot of times, actually, in my own work. I don't want to reveal exactly what happened because that goes into confidentiality stuff. But sometimes when I speak to people in my own work about things like, for example, well, what's the relationship between something like the veil and Christianity? When you see a nun wearing a veil, what do you think that's supposed to teach you? What do you think that the laity is supposed to take from seeing something like that? And the vast majority of the time, they're going to say, well, it tells us about commitment to a tradition for the sake of worshiping God. And it's like, okay, but what does that thing mean? Why a veil? Why is the woman's head covered, even in public? What's the point of that? What does it signify? Do you think that this is something that we ought to know so that it can be something that factors into how we see the Christian life? And they'll just say, I don't know, effectively. Or they'll double down and they'll say, no, you're confusing things. That's for nuns. Not even the meaning of this factors into life for lay women, or for men, because it's supposed to teach us things as well, right? So this kind of comes into a wider sort of defect in the current worldview of A, nature and grace, but that's pretty much in every era. But B, the actual gift of the incarnation itself, which is the ability to pursue something beyond our own nature. It's not merely a redemption from the negative state of sin, and it is about sanctification. It's about the granting of human beings an ability above their nature, whereby they are able to pursue something. They're able to pursue the acts of the virtues that are beyond a merely human mode, as St. Thomas says. Problem is that sanctification is generally considered, Christian and I have talked about this, as, well, it lets you do the same things, the same natural things more often and more intensely. So things that were already good are now more gooder and more consistently. And that's it. There's no actual sort of like ascent. There's no incline whereby our natural life bit by bit points more and more clearly towards supernatural beatitude in the progress of human life moving towards death. That is a big problem. And I think that that's where most of this is coming from, in the misunderstanding of the universal call to holiness, where we're going to come across even prominent Catholic authors recently that Christians have been speaking to, who are experts in specific parts of Thomistic thought, but they're now going to say things like, the Council of Chastity is not for the married. Once you've made a positive choice to be married, that council is irrelevant to you. And what that does is extremely serious, because then it turns the gospel into something that it's not, which is a tiered system, where it's almost like you have different skill trees, right? Like in a video game or something, you choose the religious skill tree, and this is how you develop towards a different metric for success. Or you become married, and then you have this other skill tree towards a different thing. So success, even within the soul, let alone in your external actions, looks completely different either side. And going to what you mentioned, the book On the Perfection of the Spiritual Life by St. Thomas, I think that there's a really beautiful section here where he draws from St. Augustine, commenting on Abraham and his state, which proves how we don't have to look at it this way, where Abraham has the habit of celibate continency, but he has the act of marital continence. Without getting into the differentiation between chastity and continence, which I think is a big problem. That's something else most people nowadays don't know. Marital continence is something which points towards celibate continence in the life of grace. You can think of it in this way. We're all called to celibacy, but some of us are called directly to celibacy, and some of us are called to celibacy through marriage. Because the universal call to holiness is a call to what? To beatitude in heaven, where you will be celibate. So either you're going to be celibate then, or you're going to be celibate immediately. And if you're not going to be celibate immediately, at least in some way, you're called to celibacy at some point in your life, provided that you don't die before your spouse, right? So there is one metric for perfection. We don't have two fathers. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's one Father. We don't have two different extremes. We don't have two different pinnacles of the Christian life. We have one. I think that that's really what's missing in the current perception. And this is why when you talk to people and you hear things like, well, that's for priests, well, that's for nuns, well, that's for monks, it kind of misses the point, right?
Yeah. Gary Gu has an interesting section on this in his fantastic work on the 3 ages of the spiritual life and 3 ages of the interior life. But he calls this like a naturalistic spirituality, which basically views the life of the non-religious, so the life of the laity, as only kind of like tending in a sort of lesser end, which is basically like you're kind of like a good person. It's like this whole idea of a good person. The good person doesn't do bad things like out in the open. They pay their taxes. They don't cheat on their wives. They sit down and read bedtime stories with their kids. They don't like cheat at business. This is the nice person sort of view of Christianity. But Christianity, of course, all those things are very good things, and you should be doing all of those things. But there's a further call that goes up and beyond this. You see this throughout the Gospels, and you see this throughout St. Paul's epistles as well, where we are called not only to like a good natural life, we're called to live the angelic life. St. Thomas is called the angelic doctor, because by his chastity, he was able to submit all of his faculties to his intellect. So as like St. Robert Bellarmine describes this, there's almost the reason we are said to have spiritual bodies is because basically our bodies, spiritual bodies in beatitude after the resurrection of the body, is basically because our bodies become completely subject to our intellects, and therefore they are given a share in supernatural glory, and our members become glorious. So that's why those who are married are called to live as if they are those who have wives be as they have none. What is that supposed to mean, guys? Those who have wives be as they have none. If this doesn't mean the fact that we are called to tend towards perfection, which will ultimately be ours in the life of glory. And I think the biggest issue that a lot of people have with this is the whole like, I honestly, anybody who there's somebody who is trying to bring, I just have to mute anybody who says this, because no matter how much explanation that's going to come into this, it's just not going to help. It's like, if I can like enjoy a good wine, or if I can enjoy a steak, why can't I enjoy the marital use as much as I want? And is it a sin for me to eat good food? Well, you're lacking a fundamental distinction in Catholic moral theology between sin and imperfection. Is for like later today, I'm probably going to be driving. And when I drive, I actually like to smoke. I like to smoke while I drive. I know, weird habit, but I like to do it. So me smoking a cigarette.
At least you're not eating steak and drinking wine.
Yeah. So it's better than eating steak and drinking wine while driving. But me smoking a cigarette, or me having, I don't know, a really good cup of coffee, or having a wine or a steak or whatever, that's an imperfection. And the reason it's an imperfection is I am in some way attaching myself to an earthly object that's going to hinder the life of perfection. But it's not a sin. It's not a sin at all to do any of those things. Because a sin has to do with some sort of breaking of a commandment, where an imperfection has to do with not meeting the demands of a council. And I think a lot of people have a fundamentally Protestant view of the way in which the commands of God work. Because Protestants, as you know, they don't have the ideas of councils or works of supererogation. They don't have their ideas in their theology. They think that there's kind of just like a single sort of like natural level in which everybody's called, which is why things like virginity don't make sense in their system. Is besides like pragmatic reasons, why would anybody live a life of virginity?
This is why Protestant Twitter exploded this week with anti-Marian propaganda. And I finally asked the crowd, okay, if your son was God, like you would need like more kids and carnal union to be happy, and like crickets.
Exactly.
But then the other thing I wanted to throw onto this,
Mm-hmm.
Other than lots of interesting stuff to talk about with the use of pleasures and the approach to perfection, which obviously books and books and hours of talk, but the real big difference with the use of marriage as opposed to a steak is one makes the reason diminish, or even disappear, right? The use of reason. This is why Thomas talks about prophets not receiving prophecy during the use of marriage, which is why you need an excuse to use marriage, whereas you don't need an excuse to put salt on your steak. You know, that's a really, really important distinction. So then you have to go back to what is the motivation or the intention for this particular marital act? Is it to have kids? Is it to pay the debt because it was reasonably requested? And I understand it as being, you know, an appeal to one's right. Or is it because I can't, you know, control myself any other reasonable way, which then means you need to work on that? Or is it because I'm bored and I want to have fun and recreate, which this is the one that comes up a lot and people have a lot of trouble with because there's been nothing but affirmation of that in the past 50 years or so, and it's kind of tended towards that way since 1852 with Guri's manual. So anyway, that's like one of the major differences between some pleasures and this particular pleasure. You lose your reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
by which you contemplate God and love him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What would be important for a lot of people, I think, is, and I think this is a reason why a lot of people struggle with this. What's important is to read the lives of the saints and read how they in their lives approached pleasures. It's very, very, very important. Because you see, even something like sleep, they wanted to deprive themselves from an attachment even to something like sleep. So, like the Dominican order for a very long time, they had a rule. As part of their rule, they couldn't sleep on a bed. They had to sleep on the floor or on and Saint Dominic was said to sleep
in the habit.
Yeah, he was said to sleep on the floor with either a Bible or a stone for his pillow, and his habit for his blanket.
There's the story, the charming story in the Vitae Fratre at Santa Sabina, which is now the Curia for the Dominicans. The Blessed Mother appeared in the convent. Okay, so if you ever get the chance to go and see around the priory there, do it, because it's really, really interesting. Several miracles in Santa Sabina and in the priory with Dominic and then with others. The Blessed Mother is walking down the hall and she's blessing rooms with holy water, right? And there's an attendant with her, an angel, right? And she skips a room because she knew that the brother inside of the room had taken his habit off because it was too warm. And at the time, the rule in the order was you sleep in your habit. He said, well, you know, tonight it's really warm. I'll just, no, not tonight. And he didn't get the blessing.
You know, I actually, I've read a lot of the early Dominican.
It was one of the other brothers because then he reported him to the prior. That's how they found out about. That's why they inquired and found out why she skipped the room. That's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, you see other saints, like, look at the way in which they approach food, for example. They're very, very careful about giving in too much to a strong appetite towards food, both in quantity and in quality. And by quality, I mean like taste. Giving into like very luxurious and rich food, because I mean, it doesn't mean like if you're out there and you're a working man, it doesn't mean you can't live the life of perfection when it comes to food. You can still eat a quantity of food. You can still eat a quantity of food that's going to keep your body intact to be able to work. Really, a lot of these considerations have to do with like overly luxurious foods. So there's actually a traditional practice called the Jesuit fast, where the Jesuits, because they had such difficult apostolic labors, they would, during their fast, they would eat the same quantity of food that they would during normal times, but they would just lower the quality of food. So like if they needed coffee, they would just drink lukewarm coffee, or they wouldn't salt and pepper their food, or like these sort of practices surrounding food.
I was going to ask if the Jesuit fast was when you fast in between snacks and meals. I guess not. It's important to add that if your penances or deprivations or pursuit of perfection is making you neurotic or bitter or resentful or to despair, or especially if it's making you proud, like I didn't put salt on my steak tonight, I'm a great Catholic or whatever, then like condescend to yourself and use pleasures, because it can backfire as well. So step by step, right?
Yeah, but I guess this is kind of like an for Diori argument that I'm trying to bring forward is if the saints were this careful in order to live the life of perfection when it came to things like food and sleep, which is like, if you think about, I mean, some people maybe it's just like, oh, I get such an intense pleasure from eating a steak with salt and pepper on it, or oh, I get such an intense pleasure from sleeping 8 hours rather than 7 hours. I mean, maybe for some people, but if they were so concerned about things like that, and even in like your own fasting practices, anybody who's a broadly traditional Catholic is going to fast and abstain on normal days of fasting and abstinence. If they were so concerned about food, and if you yourself are so concerned about food in that sense, how much more do you have to be concerned about the marital use? How much more? The traditional practice, and I guess after this we can briefly talk about the tending towards spiritual marriage. But the traditional practice is 3 days before you receive the Eucharist, the vigils of feasts, Lent and Advent. But it is important to note that every single author that I've seen does say, like, if you need to pay the debt during that time, pay the debt. Don't like, for the sake of your, and this goes, I guess, in a certain weird way, this could go with like food as well. If you need to eat for some good reason, then you should probably eat. Don't sin because of ecclesiastical positive law. Like the same actually goes for mass attendance as well, which is interesting. A lot of people misunderstand the mass attendance and the rules surrounding how mass attendance is a ecclesiastical positive law and can be dispensed with by the church in certain circumstances. Okay, so after that, any who wants to talk about spiritual marriage? Not all at once, guys. Okay, so if none of you are familiar with the concept of a spiritual marriage, so a spiritual marriage, this is something which I've actually seen an author argue that this was something that was practiced during the Apostolic Church, which is really interesting. That actually our Lord mentions it when he talks about eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. That's actually not in reference, as we think of celibates. That's actually in reference to people who have foregone the marital debt within their marriages, because that was a common practice among the Essenes, which was a certain Jewish group that there was a bit of a connection with the early church with. I can hear myself now. I mean, who can I hear myself from? It's Eamonn. I'm gonna mute you, Eamonn, real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Now I'm good.
It's also argued that it's contained in the section on vows in the Book of Numbers.
Oh, okay. I've actually never seen that argument. Okay, you're back unmuted, Eamonn. So when it comes to spiritual marriage, the whole idea is that there's two forms. The first form, and this might strike us as weird, but it kind of makes sense in some of the social contexts. So the first form it would take is those who take a vow of chastity before they get married, and their marriage isn't intending to pay the debt ever. Or there's some like really funny patristic and medieval stories about husbands and wives on their wedding nights who who don't want to pay the debt, and they like basically like evangelize the other person to like, hey, we should like engage, we should never engage in the marital use, and the other spouse is like, oh great, like let's never do that. Like it's
So romantic.
I know. But that's one form, and that form basically doesn't really happen today anymore. It even happened actually like up to the late 19th, early 20th century. I think Leo the 13th famously set up a spiritual marriage between one of the blesseds and I think one of the members of French nobility. So this is something that actually happened relatively recently as well. This isn't like crazy sort of idea. But the other form, the more common form, and actually the ordinary form, this is something which St. Augustine talks about, that there were many, 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 many members of his congregation that had reached this point. And he actually says that this is something that is within the ordinary life of grace. Matrimonial grace leads to this. But the second form is you kind of have a length of time where the marriage is maturing. So let's say you get married, and there's kind of like I would say 15 to 20 year window which you are having kids. And through this time within the marriage, you are disciplining yourself, and by the grace of matrimony, you are growing in your detachment. So you're still engaging in the use occasionally for the paying of the debt, and then also because you want children for the worship of God. But you are disciplining yourself to be able to be less and less reliant on it. And your love to your wife, and this is an important part that actually gets spoken about in the traditional authors. This isn't just like a modern like, oh, like romantics in marriage or whatever. But the love that you have for your wife is becoming less and less dependent on the use. So it's something which is becoming purified and spiritualized, that you're not dependent for your unity with your wife on the marital use. It's becoming detached from that. It's becoming spiritualized, and you're growing in a purified charity for your wife, to where your union with one another can become so perfect that it doesn't require the use in order to sustain and strengthen that union. So you have these two movements: the one movement towards unity with your spouse in charity, which St. Augustine describes. And then I think St. Augustine might also describe this point, but also the movement towards detachment from that licit pleasure. And with these
nature also inclines towards this on two accounts, not only because of the eventual infertility of the woman, but also just the natural frigidity that people develop as they age, right? Nature is actually suggesting this, and grace actually, formally completes it or perfects it.
Yeah.
Right.
So throughout this time of childbearing, you have these two movements that are occurring, both in grace and nature, so that eventually you will be able to get to a point where you're like, okay, we're not going to, outside of extremely extraordinary circumstances, because oftentimes, most of the time actually, there weren't any formal vows which were taken. So this was more of an unofficial thing. And St. Augustine actually warns couples against taking vows, just in case there is this extraordinary circumstance that requires the paying of the debt. But you get to this moment where you can completely live in a spiritual marriage, where you are following after the example of Saint Joseph and Our Lady, to where there is no necessity to pay for the debt, and one's love with one's spouse is completely based on the fact that she is loving her for the sake of God, loving her as a sister in Christ. And I think it's St. Jerome gives advice on this, because this has to be something which is mutual as well. That's very important, because you have two people involved in this. And these two people, they might not grow in a congruent way. I mean, one of the spouses may be a lot more attached to the use. So it might take
This is why the
little bit.
wife has to give permission for her husband to be ordained a deacon. That's where it comes up in canon law. I know I'm opening a can of worms there, but go read Ed Peters on this.
Mhm.
This is actually why the wife has to, like, it's not because it's a time commitment. It's because implicitly, at least in the West, the code insists on perpetual and perfect continence for all clergy,
Mhm. Mhm.
despite several letters that attempted to undo that or, you know, clarify it to the contrary of what the law actually says. That's why that's there. Interestingly enough.
That's interesting because that's like a very long-standing thing in canon law. That like goes back to the time of the apostles. Actually, it's very interesting.
Yeah. Now, don't go telling your permanent deacon friend that, like, no, it doesn't work retroactively and you're not going to convince your local bishop. So just don't try it. But
Convince my local
that is
bishop
actually what the law
to
is and what it
excommunicate
means.
any permanent deacon who has children. I was actually a thing in the medieval church where you'd have these priests who were formally married and then had to take a vow upon being married, and their wives would get pregnant, and the bishop would just like lose his freaking mind on that. Actually, this is Pope Nicholas II actually allowed for certain lay action against these priests by the laymen not giving money to them to sustain their families and refusing to go to their masses and to go to a different mass. So this is actually something that's very, very interesting. But yeah, the whole point that you need to remember is the spouses are in different positions throughout their lives. They are in different orders of detachment. So this is something where there is this like thing in the West that kind of pops up in, I want to say, like 7th, 8th, 9th century in the conversion of certain Anglo-Saxon lands, where you get these legends of these women who are like basically they want to live a life of chastity, and they basically like fight their husbands in like utterly refuse like the debt until the husband like gets so mad that he kills the wife and she ends up being a martyr. That happens in some cases, or eventually he relents. Don't do that. That wasn't appropriate for them to do, and the fathers speak against this. Eventually, the moralists
There's also a
all
huge
speak against
medieval
this.
juridical tradition on like taking vows within marriage against this. Like it's
Mhm.
it's an enormous amount of literature in the medieval world.
Yeah, so
Go through
that's another
Gratian,
thing.
go through Sanchez. You know, Sanchez isn't medieval, but like it's a huge concern of, you know, the laicity and validity of vows about this stuff and how they can be dispensed and all of the conditions. If you're
Mhm.
really interested in that stuff, there's plenty to read.
Okay, I'm trying to think whether there is anything else to add, or whether that was all what we wanted to talk about, and that was comprehensive.
I think maybe covering some of the reasons why this has become a difficulty in an area of ambiguity would be a good idea. Because a lot of people are going to wonder, well, why haven't I heard any of this before? Why haven't I heard that the very essence of the mission, a vocation through Christian marriage, according to the people on this stream, is completely different to what I've ever heard before. So now we have to explain the whatever I've heard before part. Like, why has it become so difficult? Maybe I would start by contributing that, for example, in the I looked this up when you guys were talking about the diaconate because I remembered seeing this in the 1998 directory for the ministry and life of permanent deacons. You have towards about a third of the way through, you have a short paragraph. Married deacons should feel especially obliged to give clear witness to the sanctity of marriage and the family. The more they grow in mutual love, the greater their dedication to their children, the more significant their example for the Christian community. The nurturing and deepening of mutual sacrificial love between husband and wife constitutes perhaps the most significant involvement of a deacon's wife in her husband's public ministry in the church. This love grows thanks to chastity, which flourishes even in the exercise of parental responsibilities, by respect for spouses, and the practice of a certain continence. This virtue fosters a mutual self-giving, which soon becomes evident in ministry. So this is going back to what Christian said about that special purification and development of marital love beyond something that requires the intense intimacy of physical union, right? However, this and many other references are not exactly clear in what that a certain continence means, right? And all of the references to this concept, as few as they are in the recent magisterium, are extremely ambiguous to anybody who isn't already highly familiar with the subject. So that's what I would introduce from the beginning. What do you guys think is the reason why this has been obscured?
I think a fixation on 1968, reacting to the advent of the pill, and then the advent of no-fault divorce, and then the advent of abortion, right? As we slipped down that stream, the pastoral priorities switched from let's get people to try to approach perfection to let's get people to try not to contracept and then to not kill their kids. So the priorities have changed, and probably justifiably so, right?
Yeah.
In your average marriage prep class, you're dealing with probably like 75% of couples living together, quote unquote, most of whom, are intending on using unnatural acts for most of their married life, right? So that's probably the proximate cause of this. The deeper cause, I think, is, well, all of the things that lead up to the sexual revolution, but also in the literature is Guri. And I mentioned his manual, first edition in 1852 and the second one in 1871. Don't quote me on that. But that's where you get the first time that any notable moralist talks about the expression of affection as an excuse for using marriage. And that sets up, the popular authors today. They wouldn't be saying this if it weren't for Guri. And he just kind of makes it up. It's not really founded on anything, as far as I can tell, other than his own feelings. So that's another route. And then just in general, the education of clergy on this point is really sparse and minimal. I mean, as someone who's been through the whole program and more, there's really not much being treated on this front. So
Okay, so I missed all of what you said, but I guess I'll give my 2 cents for why I think this stuff kind of evaporated. So personally, this might be a little bit of a controversial. I do agree there's something that is becoming less focused upon in our authors, but it's still there. I mean, it like when it comes to the teaching of the church, it's still there. It's like if you have the eyes to see, this is something I've noticed with myself. If you have the eyes to see and you're looking, like, yeah, it's there. It's, I mean, it in virtually contained in the Catechism. It's contained definitely in the Second Vatican Council. It's contained in the recent teaching of the Church. It's contained in a certain act of the beatification of a couple living in a Josephite marriage, or the beatification of another saint who was living in a spiritual marriage. It's there. I mean, it's there if you can see it. And that's I think the main problem is people can't see it. Why can't they see it? Well, I think we all know why people can't see it. We have been kind of imbibed in popular culture with this view of, and it's like it's really weird, like fetishization of the wife. I think is the best way of putting it. There is this fetishization of the wife. And this is expressed differently in secular circles. It's expressed differently in evangelical circles. I mean, in evangelical circles, it's kind of all surrounded about basically now you are able to carry out your lust however you so please, where before you kind of just had to hold back, and just unleash. But
now you have a sex bucket.
yeah, basically. But in Catholic circles, it takes a really weird form surrounding especially pregnancy and procreation. It takes and also like the idea of the marital debt taken in a very weird way. So it takes different forms. But the reason that people can't see these things is because they're getting the same teaching surrounding, for example, the fact that sexuality can be that the act can be meritorious in these circumstances. Church has always said that. The fact that you need to have certain self-control, the church has always said that. The fact that this is good, the church has always said that. This and that and that. The church has always said these things. The church is saying the same things. Maybe one could say it emphasizes it differently. But the reason people can't hear it is because they're not looking. So what I would encourage people to do is, after this, look in the sections on the evangelical councils and the catechism. Look in the section on marriage. Look in the section on chastity. Look in the section on countenance. And ask yourself, does this sound more like the I don't even know how to describe the sort of sexual views of the licentious Catholic marital views? I guess that's the best way of putting it. Or does it sound more like what we're saying? Look into your catechism and the sectional on morality. Looking like it's not like it directly has a paragraph to say actually tending towards this is ideal and actually need to do this. But every single one of the principles that we've derived these conclusions from are there. And sometimes it's there, but it's just stated in different words. So that's what I would encourage a lot of people to look into, because I think a huge problem that people in our position can get into is and this is on the trad side. The trad side does this with like dogmatic propositions. But the issue that we can get into is we can kind of just like feel like we got to like grasp onto like something that the past had and just like use the past as like to guard ourselves from the onslaught of whatever the magisterium is teaching now. It actually kind of challenge our opponents on this issue and ask them like, where in the world are you getting this from the teaching authority of the church? Who did you get this from, and where can you find it? Because I know exactly where they're getting this from, and it's not the Catholic Church. They're getting it from American evangelical culture. I actually
think it's a bit wider than that.
Yeah, I think it's just Western culture at large, which dilutes into American evangelical culture. You have these converts who are getting this from.
And this is where the weird ideas about masculinity also derive from, is same root, I would propose.
I think it's that these groups have given into the world in the sense of what St. Paul says the present way of the world is passing away. The present way of the world is what's been given into, and this is why I've always couched this as a kind of like effective Islamization of Christian ethics, because in Islam there is no moving beyond the sign, because the sign is the reality which you're pushing for, right? Which is why most forms of Islam, even beatitude, is concurrent with experiences of
pleasure in the lower faculties,
right? Of pleasure and taste, and of sexual carnal pleasures, right? So for there's a certain incompatibility here that's going on, because I think that like Eamonn said, we kind of moved in the direction of like okay, well, contraception is wrong, fornication is wrong, adultery is wrong. We have to push on these because now we're being told that actually they're not wrong. And then we have to even say killing your child is wrong. It's against the duties of justice you have as a mother or as a father. But I think that what that's effectively done is, because we live in a world that increasingly rejects natural law, we have unfortunately turned ourselves into the church of nature in a certain way. We've changed it into, well, our religion is natural law. Effectively, that's what how we come across the people. How we come across the people is, well, our religion is just a certain, in terms of ethics, is just a certain expression of natural law, and there's nothing that builds upon that, which is why you had that really weird interaction, Christian, with the same prominent Catholic thinker on Twitter, where he effectively cast out implicitly the entire discipline of moral theology, because he was saying, no, this is just moral philosophy. And the only reason that scripture and the fathers are being mentioned is because they are useful sources for arguments within moral philosophy. But what that does is it transforms the entire discipline into something whose sources are fundamentally about authority, because we're talking about theology, whose sources are the various loci of theology, not the various principles of natural law considered in themselves. In fact, those are towards the bottom of the hierarchy of loci. So we're missing the entire methodology of how to reason about morals from a theological perspective. And one of the things that this does is it changes everything where we talk about the analogy between the spiritual life and natural law, which is the entire theme of Psalm 118, right? It's all about a sort of like contemplation of higher things through the law, through the natural law, through the moral law, and through ceremonial laws. What they signify, everything that they signify, is only kind of like as flavor text, or, oh, that's nice, that's fitting, that it fits in these ways. So everything in the way that marriage and in the way that the consumption of food corresponds to the higher realities of mystical union or beatific union are effectively lost, and all of the reasonings from which we can make conclusions about nature from the supernatural order that it reflects are also cut out. So when we can make conclusions about the ethics of reconciliation in marriage from the way that the church treats the necessity of sacramental reconciliation prior to communion, for example. We can reason about nature from the realities of grace and the dispensation, the sacramental dispensation, and vice versa. You guys okay? What's going on?
Don't say anything. Just check the live chat.
I don't see anything. Is it something I already replied to?
Okay. Just continue. I don't want to scar you.
Okay. So
something that's lawful might not always be the best idea, just for your own, masculinity. That's all I'll say to that question.
Right. So I think that one of the reasons that we've come into a situation where nobody can see how marriage, which is a natural institution, has been raised to a supernatural institution and becomes a means of attaining to a supernatural way of life through a natural institution which has been elevated. This is kind of like a mirror for the entirety of human life in grace, in the Christian dispensation. That's why marriage is so important. It's why we should be fixated on marriage, because it's the prime analogy for the Trinity and for human life with God. And basically the way that we have come to approach marriage and all ethical issues has simply been a matter of moral philosophy. And so whenever you talk to Christians about anything that goes beyond the precepts of natural law, they get uncomfortable. And they actually think that it's somehow lacking in correspondence with our religion, because all they're familiar with is, well, Catholics believe in natural law, and that's what they'll default to. Here, I'm critiquing not the people Eamonn mentioned, the people who go to pre-K and they're already living together. They're already planning to do all manner of things once they get married. I'm talking about the conservative and even some liturgically traditionalist factions within the contemporary church.
Yeah.
Okay, so I figured if that's all, there's a few questions or objections to clarify that we could grab real quick. Not
Maybe we could read
the last question.
no. Maybe we could read through just the three major texts that people appeal to right now. That would be Herbert Yonah, William May, and then Ford and Kelly. Those are like the three big ones that people talk about. I don't have the Tanqueray text with me, but maybe we can just read through these. That'll be a good way to wrap things up. Maybe.
Okay, I just saw the question.
Okay, yeah, he saw the question. Okay, so yeah, we're not answering. Sorry to clarify. We're not answering all questions that you may have. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a few of these responses. If you wanted to grab that, yeah, I'm muting Hasan right now. Hasan is muted. So while he composes himself. So, what would be your thoughts on those who see St. Paul's statement on the married living as if not married to be referring to the common belief in impending calamity and the second coming being very soon? Well, they're correct to say that, formally speaking, that's what it's talking about. In the same way that Jimmy Akin is technically correct when he says that the rules surrounding the Vulgate and surrounding the consensus of the fathers is technically a disciplinary measure that has to do with restrictions around public disputation. Formally speaking, that's what the decree is about, and formally speaking, that's what St. Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians is about. Now, when we are gathering principles, we ask not what is formally being designated, but what is fundamentally being designated. So, what is fundamentally being designated by that decree? You have to ask yourself, why is the decree being made? What is the principle that interacts with the circumstance in order to result in the judgment? And what is fundamental there? That principle is what we're arguing from. Not necessarily saying that St. Paul was, although technically we are to live. It is correct to say that we are to live in light of the judgment of the second coming of Christ and the judgment which will come. We are to live like that. The New Testament is very clear that we are to be a people that is eschatological. And the church has always, in her finest hours, been a church that is preparing for judgment at all times, no matter what. So yeah, that's a common objection that I get, but distinguishing between that which is formal and that which is fundamental, and then also reflecting on the fact that yeah, we are to live. We are to live like the second coming is coming. We are to live as if there is impending calamity. Absolutely, that is the way in which we're to live. We're not supposed to kind of have these. We're not supposed to be like comfortable, I guess is the way. And by comfortable, I mean just kind of like chilling, like we have all of this time to somehow reform ourselves. No, reform yourself now, prepare yourself now. That's always something to be in the back of the mind to every single Catholic. Okay. Trying to see if there's anything else that I'd like to cover from the live chat. People are asking about women working. Yeah, and then when it comes to oral stimulation, which we talked about just in not so explicit terms, that is under one of those things that is essentially ordered towards completion and is approximate danger of completion. So, and also,
Yeah, in
yeah,
particular for the man.
yeah.
Can we debunk some of these modern texts?
Yeah.
Herbert, Yonah, William May, and Ford and Kelly, because they don't actually say what Will Nolan said they said, which is rather a self-own. Okay. So yeah, so Herbert Yonah, I think it's Yonah. Joan, Jone.
Okay.
This is from Moral Theology, which was a pretty popular text. This is the 1956 version, number 757. The church is teaching that natural intercourse, open to procreation, is the only legitimate form of complete sexual expression, even between spouses, does not imply that mutual genital stimulation other than intercourse is forbidden for spouses as part of the preliminaries to marital intercourse, according to several moral theologians noted for their orthodoxy. Marriage is a mutual commitment in which each side, oh no, this is May, in which each side ceases to be autonomous. Oh, this is the famous or infamous misquote of Pius XII, which is actually from Elizabeth Anscombe. So anyway, that's William May. The church is teaching that natural intercourse, open procreation, is the only legitimate form of complete sexual expression, even between spouses, does not imply that mutual genital stimulation other than intercourse is forbidden for spouses as part of the preliminaries to marital intercourse, according to several moral theologians noted for their orthodoxy. So that's a pretty weak sauce advocacy for these kinds of things. He doesn't actually say you can use these particular actions. He just sort of lays out something rather ambiguous, right? So much for William May. Then we get Herbert Yonah.
I've always just called him
Excluding Joan, Herbert Joan,
Yeah.
excluding the sodomitic intention, which we've argued in this stream is pretty much like automatically present.
De facto, yeah.
It is neither sodomy nor a grave sin if intercourse is begun in a rectal manner with the intention of consummating it naturally. Positive cooperation on the part of the wife in sodomitical commerce is never lawful, means completed. Hence, she must at least offer internal resistance. However, she may remain externally passive. Hold on, is this the right quote? Yeah. However, she may remain externally, because now he's talking about completed acts. She may remain externally passive, provided she has endeavored to prevent the sin. She thus applies the principle of double effect, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so he's going on to talk about another hot topic, which is in the news because of Archbishop Fernandez, who has recently been discovered to have promoted something which seems like the obligation to use contraception. And this runs up against a declaration of the Sacred Penitentiary, basically saying that actually you're to use violence to resist that, even at the threat of death. And we won't go through all of those quotes, but it's pretty serious. And the Confessor's Vademecum in 1997 does not override it. It actually kind of assumes it and functions together with it. Also with Casti Connubii, which just sort of glosses over this and just lays it out in general terms. That's it for Yonah or Joan. That's all he says, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and we have to remember, I think, because often you'll get like this sort of chest thumping about like, oh, this has an imprimatur on it. Oh, like like, oh, this was promulgated, and it's like, that basically means that there was because he was a Franciscan, right? It basically means there was some fellow Franciscan priest that he was buddies with who stamped it off. Like that's probably like all that it was.
It's not a whole lot more than that. Like at this point, to not get an imprimatur and a nihil obstat or an imprimi potest for religious, you have to be like a raging heretic, like egregious.
Yeah, so we do need to take Joan like on his own terms and on the terms of his arguments. But even then, I think he kind of hints at the beginning, like excluding sodomitic like affection. It's like,
Right.
okay,
He's
so
not in
you're
favor of this.
yeah, so he's not saying like, oh, just like go ahead and like engage in a copulation with the rectal orifice.
He also doesn't. He also says it's not a grave sin. He doesn't say it's not a sin. He
Yeah,
says it's not a
yeah,
grave sin, according to some theologians noted for their orthodoxy. That's all he
yeah,
says.
yeah, yeah.
It's very
So,
weak.
yeah, exactly. So this is like this is like anything but. It's like saying, oh, you can like basically this would be the like I guess this might not be the best analogy, but it'd be like saying, well, you can like kill somebody, but if you don't have murderous intent, then it's not a grave sin. It's like,
Yeah.
excuse me, like. Like, what are you talking about? You can commit sodomy if you don't have a sodomitic affections. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
as long as they're not intending to commit sodomy.
Yeah,
Sodomy is
yeah,
not a
yeah.
grave sin.
Like it, whatever you say. But yeah, Joan. On the one hand, it doesn't seem like he's just like going out and supporting this at all, and on the other hand, it's like even if he is, so what? He's just wrong, and everybody else
Yeah,
who's
he's
ever
just
written
wrong.
on this is against him, and they aren't saying like at least against that reading that it could be meritorious.
At least it's the majority. It's of the majority of the tradition is very against that. Yeah, I mean the Salmontachenses. To be fair, the Salmontachenses are complaining about weird people promoting these things. So anyway, let's go through Ford and Kelly because this is the one that Mr. Will
always bring
Nolan
up.
was really excited about. And this, I don't have the whole quote. I have just the main part of it. I'm the first
Let me see
parts
if
in
I can
brackets
pull
here.
this up on Twitter. Are you looking
Yeah,
off of
it's
the Twitter one as well?
yeah. I took the quote from there, and I'm inferring that the start of. I have the book. It's just not with me. It's in my room in Rome, and I am not in Rome right now. Preparatory acts which end with a natural marriage act. That's what is in brackets. Are per se permitted to married people to whatever extent they are necessary or useful in order to achieve satisfactory intercourse. Mutual incomplete acts, which are not immediately preparatory to intercourse, but take place at other times, are not per se illicit. So it's very unclear what he's actually talking about here.
Mhm.
He just does not say what he's talking about. Is he talking about embraces, kisses, touches, rectal acts? He doesn't say.
He's just
Says
probably talking about
incomplete acts which are not immediately preparatory but take place at other times. He doesn't say what he's talking about.
probably
That's a
talking about
big issue,
non-consummated
actually.
venereal acts.
They too are virtuous and meritorious when used in moderation. At the very least, it can be said, and here we get to the weak sauce part of the argument, right? Where he kind of backs off. At the very least, it can be said according to solid theological authority. So you're seeing a similarity with the Joan treatment, that incomplete mutual acts of married persons, again, very ambiguous, whether in immediate preparation for intercourse or at other times, are never gravely sinful as violations of chastity. It doesn't say about like modesty or other things, unless they involve a serious and unjustifiable risk of orgasm outside the marriage act, which we've argued is pretty much always there. So those are the grand arguments that people appeal to. I mean, there's also Vermeersch. I'm not sure what Lemkool says. Maybe he's another authority people use. Tanqueray, I don't have the text. There's like one or two other authorities, and that's all people appeal to. They
Yeah,
don't
I
go to
mean,
Alphonsus. They don't go through Thomas. I think actually in my research, one of the early modern manuals was talking about Bonaventure. I haven't read Bonaventure on this, but it seems like he goes through this. I'll have to look at that later. But he's not in favor, as I inferred. So
yeah, eventually,
it's a pretty strong tradition.
what would be a cool project is to, because there's a section in Lombard sentences where Lombard covers this in very brief, and that's kind of the terminus aquo for a lot of these reflections. So it'd be really cool to look through all of the sentences, commentaries, and their answers. But yeah, basically, though actually that text could absolutely be read, and kind of I think make. I think it'd be a really crazy reading of Ford and Kelly to say like, oh, you can actually have like oral stimulation outside of the marital act, and I don't think these guys are even saying that. That's
No, I don't
how you
think
would
so.
have to read him. That's how you'd have to read
Yep.
him for this.
Yeah,
to make
which
sense.
Will Noland
Now,
argued for. He said it's meritorious and virtuous. What? Hello?
Yeah. How? Like how?
What?
But really, reading it in our way, which would be okay. These are non-consummated venereal acts, so these are venereal acts which aren't essentially ordered towards completion. So everything from kisses to hugs to even manual stimulation. Those that would be a much more sensible reading of what he's talking about. He's saying like, oh, you can lovingly kiss your wife, or give her a hug, or something like that outside of
and
the
take pleasure in
marital
it.
act. Yeah, you can take some sort of enjoyment in it, and that he's saying that's fine and meritorious. So yeah, it's just such like a very odd reading when you actually like get down into what he's saying.
Yeah, and it's not a well-written paragraph at all. So, because it's so ambiguous. Now, granted, Thomas is also ambiguous in the article on the parts of lust where he talks about the vas and debitum. Well, this is what he's talking about, and also contraception in that little part where he's like, and other bestial modes of action. He's talking about a lot of things in there: weird positions, contraception, and then the vas and debitum, like consummated and unconsummated or incompleted, right? His sense of shame won't allow him to write about that stuff. I think that's what's going on there. You know, he's just like, I don't want to scandalize people by describing these things, which the Salmontechenses then complain about, right? They say all these authors talk about all these things. They're not ashamed to talk about them, and they defend them all. And unfortunately, we have people writing books and, putting out podcasts defending these things. So I think the modus operandi has to change on the part of those defending the correct view of these things.
It's literally the fact that a lot of these authors, so I mean, like, dude, poor old Joan or Ford and Kelly. I don't think they probably didn't foresee people like reading their texts like this and just being like, okay, yeah, like the rectal or oral orifice are just okay for copulation for Catholic couples. They would probably be horrified that people are reading them in that way. And it's
virtuous and meritorious.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. So any sort of closing comments or any other comments?
Oh, can we talk about the dating service we're thinking of starting?
Yeah, that'd be a good thing.
Okay, what are your thoughts, Christian? Hasan, did we clue you into this? That we might.
Eamonn kind of wants to, because he definitely it's definitely true, and I think that's why Noland and Gordon actually did what they did. But it's true that there needs to be an option for catechesis when it comes to dating that would also provide like a sort of community that would be able to bring together interested parties who are serious about these sort of things. So what Eamonn's idea is to create a very low barrier sort of service that would be directed towards catechesis when it comes to dating and marriage, and then also towards meeting other interested parties in a less sort of restricted way. You don't have to tell Eamon or I or anybody else involved how many like sexual partners you've had or anything like that. So yeah, that was sort of the idea and kind of like broad sketches. But yeah, I think
$500.
Yeah. Not pay $500. That's kind of the idea. I think that'd be a very interesting thing to work on eventually.
That sounds like
Yes,
a cool
we did
idea.
discuss to the question. We did just discuss the Fernandez contraception charity quote. That is so. I didn't read it in Spanish. The English translation is a translation, but this runs up against Denzinger 360-36. Is that right? Hold on.
I have Denzinger. Oh my.
3638 to 3640. And 3634. So you can go read those paragraphs. Basically, yeah, it's not just wrong, it's like really wrong. Like hardcore wrong, if that translation is accurate, which maybe it's not.
Okay, so 36. What do you say?
Yeah, 3634 through 40 is going to be on essentially repelling unnatural actions and the duty to do so as a wife in particular, as distinguished. The distinctions are sodomy, condomistic acts, and onanism, which is withdrawal. And Casti Canubi is paragraph 59, I think, is talking about onanistic practices. At least he doesn't contradict the responsum of the Sacred Penitentiary, which I believe was given before that document, but don't quote me on that. I can find out, though. Anyway.
Oh, look at this.
Father Basil Cole has an article on this, on the continuity with the Confessors Videmicum, Casti Canubi, and the Sacred Penitentiary responses on this. You can read that. So.
Sorry, I opened Denzinger and actually went to the Sixth Commandment section in the systematic index. There's a few interesting things that have been defined when it comes to this.
Sure. Alexander VII's condemnation is really interesting. That's a whole other stream. And that gets into the use of touches and things within marriage, which is way more complicated than this conversation.
Yeah, what's interesting is it doesn't have anything for the 9th or 10th commandment. That's interesting. Okay, so anything else, or are we good to go?
I wanted to talk to you guys about something since we were talking about potential project earlier, after the stream, maybe. That's okay.
Okay, yeah, that works with me.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, well, everybody out there, remember, as a final note, look up the angelic militia. If you happen to want to live chastely, there is a entire confraternity which is ordered towards living chastely. The married and the unmarried can join, and you get to gird yourselves with the cord of St. Thomas in order, and then there's also prayers that you can do along with that, sanctifying each one of your interior and exterior faculties. So that is something to look up. Is just look up the angelic militia, and yeah, get the cord and become part of St. Thomas's army for chastity. I know that's like imagine like, okay, we got over here, and this is an epic St. Thomas moment. But over here we have the angelic militia. What would the SCOTUS followers be called? The subtle militia? That sounds like a Redditor group. Okay, I'm sorry. I ended the stream on like a jocular manner. But okay, all of you have a fantastic day, and as always, God bless.